Hello and welcome back to the walkthrough. We are arguably on the most detailed map set in Unreal RTNP, Pali, that is Foundry and Bounds of Foundry by Cliff Blazinski. The first point of interest that occurs here that sort of caught my eye is the distinct complexion of the first room. Those two containers build up to the second floor and fill both rooms very well, and certainly give both architectural touch as well as some sort of atmospheric impression. So to start off, I'd like to point out that this is one of the maps wherein the music is a bit odd for the environment, as it seems to fit and then it doesn't, yet the environment itself sort of makes up for it. If you notice, it's actually very well lit, very well illuminated, and we can infer from that it's probably not intended to convey any sort of grimness. In that sense, we can understand that the music is a bit more fitting and the environment knows its own personality, as it were. With the exception of some cubic corridors, there are a general lack of plainness in rooms that is within this map set, and it's clear that Blazinski put significant efforts into detailing this very well. The environment has a rather fine finish because of the hazardous areas all about the two maps. It's very clear, for instance, once the player sees the conveyor belt area or the slime area, that he or she should be very alert. While environment does leave a quality mark, conceptual grandness is a bit more confusing, though once more the sense of place required to establish that is given by the intimidating components of the facility. While there may not be necessarily a substantial collection of visual icons within the map that is all in locations, there certainly is a good amount of innovation that impacts the player well enough, such that he or she will probably notice this map in retrospect. That is to say that this map is memorable to an extent, and memorable enough. Whether that would be to a great extent or not is something that cannot be said, but what is for certain is the conceptual part of the map is certainly explicated into reality. Visual impact is obvious enough, seeing as how both maps plunge the player into varying and dynamic areas, different enough, though not so much that the environment has changed, yet plenty to keep the player entertained with some forms of eye candy or other. This all referring to the visual detail, in contrast to places like Rajagar Mine in the first Unreal and other such environments that give a sense of grunge and griminess, while Foundry generally uses a lot of the same texture packs and textures. The contrast is more clarity and lack of grunge, mixed in with varying colors of lighting, which all give effect to a change in mood and perspective whereof the player gets a feeling of the map in the visual spectrum. As for architecture, we have a general style of the Unreal Mines, though the twist is added by the more innovative, outside-the-box appearances of most rooms, which is certainly a sight for sore eyes if something like Rajagar Mine gave you a sort of malady. Now comes the big part, the best part, gameplay. The previous excursion in the UMS Prometheus might have left a few players with their heads spinning, though mostly because of the marine confrontation, in great contrast to putting a few marine spawns here and there on top of the ship, not at all implying that that was worth the fight. Blazinski somehow captures the essence of combat intensity with very common combat scenes. The oddest thing about this map is it generally contains Scar, and while they may be a harmful foe, having seen thousands throughout campaigns and whatnot, the standard and ordinary Scar battles are generally boring to the veteran Unreal player. However, in this set of maps, Blazinski seems to ingeniously add a twist to the extremity of Scar combat scenarios, if you will. Not only are the Scar waiting around the corner, in every corner, with respect to monster placement and balance, but mixed in with the environment of the map, the narrow hallways leading to large industrial machinery, and then and back again, multi-level platforms, rooms whereupon the turrets are there, of sorts, and such other things, give off a very unique feel to the gameplay. What could have been another ordinary and trite encounter becomes a series of battles that even the most adept players have to keep their eyes open for. Gameplay flux is somewhat more challenging to notice, as it sometimes there are times when more novice players tend to find themselves lost in a vast facility, though other times it is quite clear where the player must go, though not too much to allow the door to be opened to the next level. The low point comes in this review when we get to storyline implementation. When this comes to play, none of the translator events have anything to do with any sort of story background or plot. Were it not for the intermissions, some players may be confused as to what's going on. Fortunately, there are intermissions, and it is understandable that the player is going through this facility to get to the ship, which will launch him off to something other than Pali. Though in summary, very little else could be said about the storyline, and if something like Rajigar Mine can contain at least a little bit of information about something, then there is little excuse except timing that would omit this set of maps from presenting at least a tad bit of storyline in one form or another. So incidentally, in accordance with that, Atmosphere received a 4, Conceptual Grandness 3, Visual Impact 4, Gameplay 4, and Storyline Implementation 2, and that gives us an overall rating of 3.6, which is a bit of a surprise for me because in retrospect I felt this map not to be so much nostalgic as it was a bit annoying, especially because of the monotony here and there, and it can get a little bit mundane, but I suppose that in general and when looking at it a bit more professionally, more critically, and more objectively, certainly, you come up with a better rating because it certainly is well developed. And I suppose that negativity I have towards it does have something to do with the intensity of combat, which is in a sense a good thing. But again, the one problem would mainly be the monotony of it. With the exception of that, this is a very well designed map. Now, I do not mean to rip this off by pasting this in here, nor do I mean to add a behavior of habit by as in I'm not going to continue to do this, but I really did have to comment on this certain campaign. I heard of this campaign, I've read about it, and the review I read about it was rather sour. So I've decided to check it out myself. What actually happened was I was on a cooperative server, and I found this campaign on their map pro list and decided to look at it, and afterwards download it to actually feel, the real gameplay. So the first thing that is problematic about this campaign is the mere fact that the storyline is well, I mean, to bluntly explain, it's a cliche. Now, when I first realized that you crash land on a planet and you were in a ship, it sort of stunned me, and that really impacted I could not contain myself because it's ridiculous how many campaigns take on this cliche of crash landing on the ship and then everyone's in trouble, everybody's dead, and you have to get out or something like that. Because that's pretty much what happens. Sure, you can add something like, in this case, what happens is there's an artifact that's a little twisted, but that's not enough to make it a deviation of anything. It's the exact replica of, well, you know, a cliche. Now, sure, you can omit and you can say that the storyline isn't so important as is the gameplay, but that, if you notice that the more well-developed storylines come from more well-developed campaigns, meaning better gameplay. And this also has to do with the attachment of the storyline to the actual maps and what's happening. And so you will notice some correlations between you know, the storyline and this map's quality, and the map's quality in the campaigns. If you'll notice now, I'm being attacked by a crab, or what looks like a crab, and believe it or not, this is basically the only monster in the entire campaign, with the exception of a warlord, some spiders, and I'm pretty sure that's it. Well, it's actually not crab or a Shrek, whatever you want to call it. It's a male commando with the model of a Shrek, and it's slightly modified because there's also what the mapper calls Marines, I think, in the 3rd and 4th maps, which are basically the same thing. Now, if I weren't so exceptionally skilled at Unreal Combat, I'd probably take a few tries to get through this. Of course, I did not, and I passed the entire thing without dying, but I stopped the 3rd map because I realized how terrible it was of a campaign. And I don't mean that in any way as to intentionally say it was horrible or try to, you know, defame the campaign by giving it negative connotations, but honestly and objectively it was not very good. So just let me show you what you should not do. Let me turn this into something positive and give you some tips as to how to make a good campaign by doing what you should do instead of doing what this mapper did. Basically, you know, going from our list, let's start out by saying the lighting. You know, of course, this does not at all, you know, emphasize, accentuate the campaign whatsoever, so much as the gameplay does. But the lighting is good in some areas, and it is bad in others. As you can see, the lighting in the outer areas was somewhat awkward because everything seemed completely unlit, and you didn't know where the light was coming from because everything was soft light, which is fine. But if you want to make a very emphatic map, I think you should use more hard lighting, if you will. Again, that's not at all the problem, so much as, for example, the maps themselves, the concepts of the map themselves. Remember that conceptual grandness requires some sense of place. For instance, the map itself, an atmosphere of the previous map, the Outer World map, claims to be Siberia, but it's just some small outer area with a few ugly-looking textured log cabins there, and it looks very rushed. And for instance, the cave maps are essentially just sure, you can make a cave, and that's nice that, you know, you have the skill or experience to make caves with BSP and whatnot, but I mean, why make a cave if it's not interesting, not impacting at all? It's just somewhere. It's essentially a hallway to the next map is what this map is, and that really bores the players to death. And the fact, literally, the entire cave is just a giant hallway for 90% of the time. That does not help. I would also like to point out that the gameplay is a bit odd, because really the entire time you're fighting these crabs, and mind you, it said the Scar were the ones that were trying to take the Mali artifact. There's nothing but crabs inside this cave in the middle of Siberia, apparently, with flat cannons and rivers, etc. The reason it's a problem is because there is really no balance between health, weaponry, and style of combat. It's just a big chaotic mess, really. So at the end of the day, looking back on this, yes, the appearances of some areas, the visual impact was nice. The mapper isn't a terrible mapper, certainly not, but I would not at all say that he is in a position to be a very skilled mapper in terms of knowing wholly all the components of game design or making a campaign on Unreal. The reason being, as you've just seen in that little clip, is all of these things come into one to make a statement about the mod, and I've commented about this before. It's basically going to be a yes or no statement player as to whether this campaign was good or not most of the time. And for instance, the components of gameplay certainly overrode those of appearance, and these are the kinds of campaigns that have maybe a nice appearance to them at times, but the gameplay, for instance, is so sour and just it seemed untested, but indeed it's so sour that it sort of makes the player forget about all the nice components about it. That one component certainly stands out. So essentially what I'm trying to say is, again, not to tear down the map in any way, but if you want to look at an example of a map or map campaign such as this one that's halfway there, as in it has the visuals to be acceptable, but it doesn't have the storyline, it doesn't have the gameplay, this is something you should look at. Certainly compare your maps as well as beta test them, but additionally you should consider that the entire concept of what your mapping should be more than just a map, a hallway, like a sort of medium between maps. That's a problem. Whenever you have something that isn't inspiring, then your maps are not going to be very interesting. They're just going to be average maps, or perhaps below average maps. Now, I might not be so well renowned enough to have the credibility, perhaps, according to you, to say any of this, but
operated by the Scar.
if you don't believe
They
me,
must have
then
another colony around.
analyze and look at
Scar
campaigns such as 7 Bullets or City of Gold,
but this
or
time,
Operation
I'm
Pali.
hunting them. They didn't seem to know I was
And
coming.
the reason all these three stand out
I figure I'm about halfway to the shuttle.
continually throughout people referencing them is because they are outstanding campaigns. And how did they do that? They certainly did not do that by following the example of such a campaign as we just saw. They do that by ensuring that their maps are unique and different, not only in the pragmatic manner, but the conceptual manner. I mean, do these maps really stand out? And I guess that's a question that you can ask yourself. Whereupon answering it, you can consider where your map is at in terms of it being either on one end or the other in terms of
It took everything I had to get through the rest of that miserable Pteridium processing plant. At least I killed a whole bunch of Scar and left the place a real mess. The Scar won't be using that place for a while. I thought I had it made when I saw the small alien ship in the middle of that seemingly endless plant. I thought I could use it to get off planet, but it's busted. The shuttle is the only escape.